There is a quiet kind of strength that most people never discover, not because it is hidden from them or locked away behind some secret door that only the chosen few can open, but because they spend their entire lives looking for it in the wrong places. They search for it in other people's approval, in the comfort of their bank accounts, in the promise of a future that keeps shifting just beyond their reach, and all the while, this strength, this unshakable, extraordinary power sits patiently inside them, waiting to be noticed. James Allen knew about this. He wrote about it over a century ago in a small, quietly revolutionary book called From Poverty to Power, and later in his reflections on how to light the darkness of life's most difficult moments. And what he discovered, what he tried to pass on to every single person willing to sit down and truly listen, is something that could change the way you wake up tomorrow morning. This is not a story about a man who had everything go right for him. This is not one of those polished, comfortable tales where someone with all the right advantages writes about how easy it is to be at peace. James Allen lived through real hardship. He knew what it felt like to watch the world fall apart around him, to carry weight that seemed too heavy for one set of shoulders, to stand at the edge of despair and wonder whether any amount of effort or goodness or patience could possibly make a difference. And yet, from that place, from that exact kind of darkness that most of us either try to escape or deny entirely, he built a philosophy of life so practical, so grounded in the actual texture of human experience, that it still speaks directly to the heart of anyone who encounters it today. What you are about to hear is not just a summary of ideas. It is, if you will let it be, a mirror held up to your own life, your own struggles, your own hidden potential. Every single difficulty you have ever faced, every hardship you have quietly endured, every moment when you felt like the ground was shifting beneath your feet, all of it has been preparing you for something. That is the central truth that James Allen returned to again and again, and it is the truth we are going to spend the next stretch of time exploring together, deeply, honestly, and without any of the shallow comfort that tends to evaporate the moment real life comes knocking. So let us begin not with abstractions, but with something you already know in your bones. Life is difficult. There is no serious, thoughtful person alive who would disagree with that statement. Bills come due at the worst possible times. Relationships, even the ones you pour your whole heart into, sometimes fracture in ways that leave you breathless. Health, which most of us take completely for granted until it falters, can shift in an instant. Careers that seemed solid as bedrock can suddenly give way. Children go through things that break their parents' hearts. Friendships fade, dreams get delayed, revised, or quietly buried. None of this is exceptional. None of this is a sign that something has gone uniquely, catastrophically wrong with your life. This is just life, in its full, unfiltered, sometimes brutal honesty. But here is where Allen's thinking begins to depart from ordinary complaint, ordinary resignation, ordinary make-the-best-of-it advice. He does not say that difficulty is simply something to be endured, gritted through, or survived. He says something far more interesting, and, once you really hear it, far more liberating. He says that difficulty, properly understood and properly engaged with, is not the enemy of a good life. It is, in fact, one of the primary tools through which a good life is built. The struggles you face are not interruptions to your growth. They are the growth itself. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it is worth slowing down for. If difficulty is the tool, if the friction and the resistance and the weight of hard circumstances is actually the force that shapes character, the way a river shapes rock, then the way you relate to difficulty matters more than whether difficulty is present in your life. You cannot prevent difficulty. Nobody can. But you can completely transform your relationship to it, and that transformation, Allen would tell you, is everything. Now, before we go deeper into his philosophy, let us talk about something that tends to come up whenever anyone starts discussing the idea that our inner life shapes our outer circumstances. There is a very understandable objection that goes something like this. That sounds nice in theory, but some people face genuinely impossible circumstances. Some people are born into poverty, or face discrimination, or deal with illness or violence that has nothing to do with their mindset. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that if they just thought differently, everything would be fine? And it is a fair objection. It deserves a real answer, not a dismissal. Alan never argued that positive thinking magically dissolves injustice, or that the suffering of people in desperate circumstances is simply a reflection of their poor attitude. He was far too honest and too clear-eyed for that kind of comfortable, convenient nonsense. What he argued was more subtle and more powerful. He said that while we cannot always control what happens to us, we retain in virtually every circumstance, short of the most extreme physical constraint, the power to choose how we respond, how we interpret, how we orient ourselves to what is happening. And that power, even in conditions of genuine suffering and genuine hardship, is not nothing. It is, in many ways, the most important power a human being possesses. There is a story that illustrates this with almost painful clarity, and it is not from Alan's book, but from history itself. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to write Man's Search for Meaning, described something he observed among his fellow prisoners in the camps, which were among the most horrific conditions any human being has ever been forced to endure. He noticed that even there, even in that darkness, some people retained their dignity, their capacity for kindness, their inner sense of purpose. They shared their last piece of bread with someone else. They comforted people who were falling apart. They refused to let the destruction of their outer circumstances also destroy the one thing that remained inviolably theirs: their attitude, their inner response, their choice about how to interpret what was happening to them. Frankl called this the last human freedom, and he said it was the one thing that no external force could take away without our permission. Alan was writing about the same fundamental truth, though from a less extreme vantage point. He was writing for ordinary people, living ordinary lives, facing ordinary but deeply felt difficulties, and his message to them, to us, was this: the quality of your inner life determines the quality of your experience of the outer world. Not because the outer world changes to accommodate your inner state, though often, over time, it genuinely does, but because your inner state determines what you see, what you notice, what you are capable of, what kind of effort you make, and therefore what kind of results begin to gradually accumulate around you. Let us take this down from the level of philosophy and into something concrete, because Alan was always interested in the practical application of these ideas, not just the elegant theory. Imagine two people who both lose their jobs on the same day, under similar circumstances. Both of them face real financial pressure. Both of them have real responsibilities and real reasons to be afraid. One of them collapses inward. He spends the first week in a kind of paralyzed shock, scrolling through his phone, lying awake at 3 a.m, rehearsing worst-case scenarios, telling himself that this proves he was never good enough, that the world is unfair and punishing, and that he has no real control over what happens to him. He sends out a few half-hearted applications, but does not really believe they will amount to anything, and so they do not. Weeks pass. The fear compounds. The other person is also afraid. She also lies awake some nights. She also feels the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. But she does something different with that fear. She sits down after the initial shock has passed, and she asks herself a very different set of questions. Not why did this happen to me, but what does this make possible? Not what does this prove about my value, but what have I been putting off that I might now have the space to pursue? Not how do I protect myself from any more pain, but what is the next useful concrete step I can take today? She applies for jobs, yes, but she also calls people she has been meaning to reconnect with. She takes an online course in an area she has been curious about for years. She organizes her finances not out of panic, but out of clear-eyed strategy. And gradually, not overnight, not without setbacks, but gradually her circumstances begin to shift. Same starting point, very different trajectories. What was different? Not luck, not advantage, not some mysterious external blessing. What was different was the inner orientation, the questions asked, the meaning made of the same event. This is what Alan was pointing at, and it is exactly as practical and as verifiable as it sounds. One of the most important things Alan wrote about was the concept of what he called the law of cause and effect as it applies to the inner life. Most of us understand cause and effect in the physical world without any trouble. You plant a seed, water it, give it sunlight, and eventually, if conditions are right, something grows. You neglect to maintain your car engine, and eventually it fails. You exercise consistently over months and years, and your body becomes stronger. These are obvious, logical, unsurprising chains of cause and effect that nobody argues with. But Alan said the same law operates with equal precision in the inner world of thought, attitude, and character. What you habitually think, what you habitually feel, what you habitually believe about yourself and about life, these things are seeds, and they grow. They produce fruit in your life, in your relationships, in your work, in your health. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always inevitably. This is both a challenging and a deeply hopeful idea. Challenging because it means that if you look honestly at the circumstances of your life and find them lacking, you cannot simply point at the world and assign all responsibility elsewhere. Some of it, perhaps more than is comfortable to acknowledge, reflects the quality of the inner seeds you have been planting. But hopeful because it also means that if you begin, today, to plant different seeds, to cultivate different thoughts, different attitudes, different beliefs about what is possible and what you deserve and what you are capable of, the harvest must eventually change. It has to. That is how the law works. And unlike so many things in life that are outside your control, the garden of your own mind is something you can tend. Starting right now, Alan drew a very clear distinction between two fundamentally different ways of engaging with life's difficulties, and understanding this distinction is like being handed a key that unlocks a door you may have been standing in front of for years without realizing it was there. The first way is what he called the way of reaction. This is the default mode for most people, and there is nothing shameful about it. When something goes wrong, you react, you feel the sting, you feel the fear or the anger or the grief, and those feelings drive your next actions, which are usually defensive, contracted, aimed at protection or blame or escape. In the short term, this feels entirely natural and even necessary, but as a long-term strategy for navigating a life that will inevitably include difficulty, it is exhausting and ultimately self-defeating. The second way is what Alan called the way of response, and the difference is subtle but everything. To respond, rather than react, is to insert a moment of conscious choice between the event and your action. It is to say, not necessarily with words, but with the orientation of your whole being, I will not be entirely at the mercy of this circumstance. I will feel what I feel, I will acknowledge the difficulty fully and honestly, and then I will choose what meaning I assign to it and what I do next. This is not emotional suppression. It is not the stiff upper lip refusal to acknowledge pain. It is something far more mature and far more powerful, the capacity to be present with difficulty without being swept away by it. There was a woman, let us call her Maria, who grew up in a household where money was always scarce and anxiety was always present. Her parents were good people, hard-working and loving, but they carried a particular belief about life that they passed along to their children without ever meaning to. The belief that financial struggle was simply the lot of people like them, that comfort and ease and abundance were for other kinds of people, people born into different circumstances, with different advantages and different luck. Maria absorbed this belief the way children absorb everything, completely and unconsciously. And for the first 30 years of her life, that belief ran in the background of everything she did, shaping her choices, limiting her expectations, and creating, with uncomfortable reliability, exactly the circumstances it predicted. She worked hard, genuinely hard, but always just a little below the level of her actual potential, because somewhere deep down she did not quite believe that her fullest effort would lead anywhere worth going. She turned down opportunities that frightened her with their scale. She undercharged for her services. She avoided conversations about money because they made her feel the old anxiety crawling up her spine. And her financial life reflected all of this with almost mathematical precision. Then something happened that she would later describe as the best and worst event of her life. She was fired from a job she had held for 9 years. Not for poor performance, but because the company was restructuring and her entire department was eliminated. She drove home that day feeling completely hollowed out, a 32-year-old woman sitting in traffic with a box of desk belongings on her passenger seat, and 9 years of assumed security suddenly evaporated. And in that hollow, terrible space, something unexpected happened. She had nothing left to protect. the thing she had been unconsciously arranging her whole professional life around, the preservation of a security that was never really as solid as she had imagined, was gone. And in its absence, for the first time, she could see clearly. She started asking different questions. Not the worried, contracted questions her parents had always asked, not the "how do we protect what little we have" as questions, but genuinely expansive questions. What do I actually want to do with my time on this earth? What skills do I have that the world genuinely needs? What have I been afraid to attempt because I was too busy protecting something that wasn't even really there? It took months. There were hard months, genuinely hard, with real financial pressure and real uncertainty. But she used those months differently than she would have before. She built something. She started small, offering a service she had always been good at but had never thought to monetize directly. She found 3 clients, then 8, then 20. Within 2 years, she was earning more than she ever had at the job she had lost. But more importantly, she was earning it in a way that felt entirely aligned with who she actually was. Was it easy? No. Did it happen because she simply changed her thoughts and the universe delivered? No. It happened because changing her thoughts changed her actions, and changing her actions, sustained over time, changed her results. That is the mechanism Alan was describing. Not magic, not wishful thinking, practical, sequential, cause and effect reality. Let us talk now about suffering, because Alan does not shy away from it, and neither should we. There is a particular kind of suffering that is very common and very human, and it comes from the gap between what is and what we believe should be. We suffer when reality fails to match our expectations. We suffer when people do not behave the way we think they should. We suffer when life takes a turn we had not planned for and did not consent to. And a great deal of this suffering, Alan suggested, is not actually caused by the events themselves, but by our resistance to them. Our insistence that things should be otherwise, our inability or unwillingness to accept what is actually happening as the starting point from which our response must begin. This might sound like a cold teaching, or like an instruction to simply be fine with everything, to swallow your pain and call it acceptance. But that is not what Alan meant, and it is worth being very precise about this. Acceptance, in the way he understood it, is not passive. It is not resignation. It is not the decision to feel nothing and want nothing and hope for nothing. Acceptance is the clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality as it actually is, which is the absolute prerequisite for changing that reality in any meaningful way. You cannot navigate a ship through fog by insisting the fog is not there. You have to see the fog, acknowledge it, maybe even respect the danger it presents before you can navigate it skillfully. When you resist accepting the reality of a difficult situation, when you spend your energy arguing with the fact of its existence rather than engaging with it, you are giving most of your power away to the situation itself. Your mental resources, which are real resources, just as real as money or time or physical strength, are consumed by the argument. There is nothing left over for the actual creative work of finding a way forward. Acceptance frees those resources. It says, yes, this is happening. I do not prefer it. I may find it painful or frightening or unfair, and I am going to deal with it from a place of clarity rather than a place of contracted, exhausted resistance. Alan wrote beautifully about the way that certain qualities of character, what he called virtues, are not simply nice things to have, but are actually the tools through which life's difficulties are resolved. And he made an observation that is easy to skip over, but deserves to be held carefully. He said that the difficulties in our lives tend to correspond very precisely to the qualities of character that are still undeveloped in us. Not as a punishment, not as evidence of cosmic cruelty, but as a kind of curriculum. If impatience is a consistent pattern in your life, life will keep presenting you with situations that require patience until you develop it. If you struggle with trust, you will keep encountering situations that challenge your capacity for trust until you find a way to meet that challenge at a deeper level. If you habitually avoid confrontation and then feel resentful of the results of your own avoidance, life will keep handing you situations that call for honest, courageous conversation until you develop the courage to have one. Seen this way, the repetitive patterns in your life, the same kinds of difficulties that seem to follow you from job to job, relationship to relationship, situation to situation, are not evidence that the world is conspiring against you. They are evidence that there is something specific you are being asked to learn, a particular capacity that is waiting to be developed. And the moment you develop it, genuinely and deeply, not as a performance, but as a real shift in how you meet the world, the pattern tends to dissolve. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but it dissolves because the lesson has been learned and the curriculum moves on. This is one of the most practically useful things you can do with a difficult period in your life. Look at it and ask, what is this teaching me? Not in a mournful, self-pitying way, but in a genuinely curious, genuinely investigative way. If I were designed to grow through this experience, what would the growth look like? What quality would I need to develop in order to meet this challenge with grace? And then, rather than simply hoping to get through it and out the other side unchanged, actively choosing to cultivate that quality. That is how difficulty becomes development. That is how suffering becomes, over time, strength. Near the 10-minute mark of this reflection, it feels important to pause and acknowledge something. If you are listening to this, there is a very good chance you are going through something. Maybe something significant and obvious. A major life disruption that everyone around you can see. Or maybe something quieter. A persistent low-grade dissatisfaction. A sense that life should somehow be more than this. A feeling that you are capable of more than you have managed to express so far. Whatever it is real, and it matters, and you deserve more than platitudes about it. So let this also be said plainly, this kind of thinking, the shift from reaction to response, from resistance to engagement, from victimhood to agency, it is not something that happens all at once. It is a practice. It is something you choose and then choose again, and then choose again, especially when everything in you wants to contract and blame and retreat. The fact that it is hard does not mean it is wrong. It means it is worth something. If this kind of content genuinely helps you, if sitting with these ideas feels like something valuable to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might need to hear exactly what you are hearing right now, and it costs you nothing except the few seconds it takes. Your support is what makes it possible to keep creating this kind of content, and we are truly grateful for it. Now, let us go deeper into one of the most specific and practical dimensions of Alan's thinking, the relationship between self-mastery and circumstance. This is where his philosophy gets especially interesting, and especially demanding. Most people operate on the assumption, usually unconscious, that their inner state is determined by their outer circumstances. If things are going well, they feel good. If things are going badly, they feel bad. This sounds completely obvious and even reasonable, right? Of course you feel worried when you are in a financially precarious situation. Of course you feel sad when a relationship ends. Of course you feel anxious when your health is uncertain. These emotional responses are natural and human, and there is nothing wrong with having them. But Alan was pointing at something more nuanced. He was pointing at the long-term pattern, the habitual way in which people hand their inner state entirely over to their circumstances, making their peace, their happiness, their sense of possibility entirely contingent on things they cannot control. And the result of that handover, that complete surrender of inner sovereignty, is a life that feels like it is being lived at the mercy of forces entirely outside the self. And that is a deeply uncomfortable way to live, regardless of how favorable or unfavorable those outer forces happen to be at any given moment. Self-mastery, as Alan understood it, is the gradual, patient, lifelong work of developing the capacity to meet whatever arises from a stable inner center. Not from numbness, not from emotional flatness, not from some kind of artificial cheerfulness that denies the reality of difficulty, but from a genuine inner groundedness, a quality of presence that does not shatter when things get hard. And this quality is not some rare gift that only certain people are born with. It is a skill. It is developed through exactly the same mechanism by which any skill is developed. Attention, intention, practice, and time. Think about someone you know, or have perhaps read about, who seems to have this quality. Someone who faces difficult things, genuinely difficult things, and seems to navigate them with a kind of calm steadiness that you find both admirable and slightly mysterious. What is different about them? Almost always, when you look closely, It is not that they are unaffected by difficulty. They feel it. They process it. But they have developed, through experience and through conscious effort, the capacity to stay present with the difficulty without losing their fundamental orientation toward life. They have learned, at some deep level, that they are not defined by their circumstances. They are defined by how they choose to meet them. There is a concept in Alan's work that he does not name directly, but that runs through everything he writes. And it is the concept of what we might call character as destiny. The idea that who you are, in the deepest, most consistent sense of that phrase, the values you actually live by rather than the ones you merely subscribe to, the habits of mind you have cultivated, the way you habitually treat other people and treat yourself. This is the most reliable predictor of the shape your life will take. Not your circumstances, not your starting point, not your advantages or your disadvantages. Your character. This is simultaneously the most demanding and the most liberating idea in all of Alan's thinking. Demanding because it places real responsibility on you. You cannot look at your life and see only the fingerprints of luck or fate or other people's choices. Some of what you see is you, expressed outward into circumstance. Liberating because it means that if you want a different life, you have a clear path. Develop a different character. Become a person who meets difficulty with courage rather than avoidance. Become a person who tells the truth, consistently, even when it is uncomfortable. Become a person who does the work, the real work, not just the visible, impressive-looking work, but the unglamorous, consistent, daily work of actually becoming who you aspire to be. And watch, over time, as your circumstances begin to reflect that change. Alan was particularly interested in the quality of thought, not in an abstract, mystical way, but in the very practical sense that the quality of your thinking determines the quality of your decisions, and the quality of your decisions, accumulated over years, determines the shape of your life. He would have us pay close attention to what we habitually think about, what we rehearse in our minds when no one is watching, what stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what is possible for us. Most people's inner mental life, if they were honest about it, contains a surprising amount of repetitive, unhelpful content. Worried rehearsal of future scenarios that will probably never happen. Replaying of past hurts and injustices that cannot be changed. Comparison of their own internal experience, messy and imperfect, to the carefully curated external presentation of other people's lives. This is not a criticism. This is just what the untended human mind does when left to its own devices. It drifts toward what is familiar, even when what is familiar is anxiety-producing or self-limiting or simply false. The work that Alan is describing, and it really is work, is the gradual, patient redirection of that habitual mental content. Not by denial, not by forcing yourself to think happy thoughts when you do not feel happy, but by the sustained, conscious effort to bring your thinking into better alignment with reality, with what is actually true, actually possible, actually worth your attention and energy. This includes things like catching yourself in the middle of a worry spiral and asking whether the worry is actually helping you prepare for something real or just consuming your mental energy. It includes noticing when you are rehearsing a story about yourself that is smaller than the evidence actually supports. It includes the discipline of returning your attention again and again to what is actually in front of you rather than the imagined future disasters or past regrets. None of this is easy. None of this is natural in the early stages. It requires what Alan would call cultivation, the same patient, persistent effort that a gardener brings to a plot of land that has been neglected and overgrown. You do not transform an overgrown garden in a day. You work with it, steadily, removing what does not belong, nurturing what does, and trusting that the cumulative effect of consistent attention will eventually produce something worth seeing. Let us spend some time now with the specific experience of failure, because it is one of the most universally human experiences and one that Alan addressed with particular care and insight. Failure is painful. Not just intellectually uncomfortable, but physically, viscerally painful in a way that can feel almost like grief. When something you have put genuine effort and genuine hope into does not work out, there is a real loss to be mourned. The loss of the future you had imagined, the loss of the version of yourself you thought you were becoming. sometimes the loss of relationships or resources or opportunities that were tied up in the failed endeavor. All of that is real, and Alan would not ask you to dismiss it or hurry past it. But he would ask you, once you have moved through the acute phase of that grief, to look at the failure with a different quality of attention. Not the attention that says, "This proves I was foolish to try, or wrong to hope, or doomed by circumstances I cannot control." But the attention that says, "What is actually here? What did this teach me about myself, about the approach I took, about the gap between where I thought I was and where I actually was in terms of skill or knowledge or readiness? What would I do differently, knowing what I know now? And most importantly, what is the next step forward from this exact place?" Thomas Edison, who failed spectacularly and repeatedly in the development of the light bulb, made a comment that has become so famous it risks losing its meaning through repetition, but it is worth really sitting with. When asked about his thousands of failed attempts, he said he had not failed thousands of times. He had successfully discovered thousands of ways that did not work, and each one brought him closer to the one that did. This is not a clever reframe designed to make failure feel less bad. It is an accurate description of how genuine development actually works. Every serious attempt, whether it produces the desired result or not, generates information, and information, used well, is progress. The people who build extraordinary lives are not the people who fail less than everyone else. They are almost always the people who fail more, and who have developed the discipline to extract value from each failure rather than being defined or defeated by it. They fail faster, they fail more specifically, they fail with better questions afterward, and they keep going. Now, here is something that Alan observed that most people find a little uncomfortable when they first encounter it, but that tends to feel increasingly true the longer you sit with it. He noticed that the people who seem to attract the most sympathy, who are most skilled at describing the unfairness of their circumstances, who can explain in the most compelling detail why their situation is beyond their control and their suffering is therefore inevitable. These are very often the people who are suffering most persistently and most unnecessarily, not because life is being especially cruel to them, but because the very mental habit of positioning oneself as a victim of circumstances, however emotionally satisfying it might be in the short term, is deeply incompatible with the kind of inner engagement that would actually change those circumstances. This is a delicate point, because genuine victimization is real and does happen, and it would be both cruel and dishonest to suggest that everyone who suffers is suffering by their own choice, or because of their own thinking. That is not what Alan was saying. But he was pointing at something important. The story you tell about your circumstances, whether you tell it primarily as something happening to you or primarily as something you are navigating, has practical consequences. It affects what you look for, what you notice, what options you perceive, what actions feel available to you. Victims of circumstance tend to wait for circumstances to change before they can act. Navigators of circumstance tend to act, often imperfectly, in the direction of change, right now, from wherever they happen to be standing. There is a man, let us call him Daniel, who spent the better part of a decade telling the story of how his particular set of disadvantages made success impossible for someone like him. He had grown up without resources, in a neighborhood where aspiration was often treated as a kind of pretension. He had not had access to the educational opportunities that he saw other people enjoying. He had been passed over for opportunities that had gone to people with connections he did not have. All of these things were real. None of them were invented or exaggerated. And the story he built around them was genuinely compelling, genuinely sympathetic, genuinely something that most listeners would nod along to without question. But Daniel noticed something, gradually and uncomfortably. While he was telling this story, while he was waiting for the world to acknowledge the unfairness and compensate him for it, nothing was changing. He was not accumulating any of the things he said he wanted. He was not developing any of the skills he claimed the world had denied him the chance to develop. And the people around him who had started in similar circumstances, but who told different stories about those circumstances, who said, "This is hard and I am going to figure it out," were starting to pull ahead in ways that were impossible to ignore. So he did something difficult. He sat down with the honest question, given that my past is real and my disadvantages are real, what am I actually going to do about them? Not what should the world do about them, not what do other people owe me in recognition of them, but what am I going to do? And the moment he genuinely engaged with that question, something shifted, not all at once, not without setbacks and frustrations and days when the old story rushed back with tremendous force. But gradually, unmistakably, the shape of his life began to change because his inner orientation had changed. And that inner orientation was the actual driver all along. Alan spent considerable time thinking about the nature of patience, not as a passive quality, but as an active one. The patience he admired and recommended was not the patience of someone who sits quietly and waits for things to improve. It was the patience of someone who understands that growth is a process, that the significant transformations in human life almost never happen overnight, and who therefore continues to engage, continues to plant seeds, continues to do the work, even in the absence of immediate visible results. This kind of patience is actually a form of faith, not necessarily religious faith, though it can be that, but faith in the basic structure of cause and effect, faith that consistent right action, sustained over time, must eventually produce results consistent with that action. We live in a culture that makes this kind of patience genuinely difficult. Everything around us is calibrated to deliver immediate feedback and instant results. You post something online, and within minutes you know how many people responded to it. You order something on the internet, and it arrives the next day. You swipe in one direction, and someone who might be a match for you appears instantly. This is in many ways wonderful. But it also trains us to expect that meaningful results should come quickly. And when they do not, we tend to interpret the absence of immediate results as evidence that we are doing something wrong, or that the thing is not working, or that we should try something else. But the most important things, the things that actually last, rarely work this way. Character development is slow. The compounding of genuine skills takes years. The building of real trust in relationships happens over time and cannot be rushed. The development of the kind of inner stability Alan was describing is, for most people, a lifelong project, not a weekend workshop experience. And this is not a disappointment. It is actually a kind of gift, because it means that every single day, through the choices you make and the quality of attention you bring to your own inner life, you are contributing to something real and lasting and genuinely yours. One of the things that Alan noticed about people who navigate life's difficulties most skillfully is that they have, consciously or not, made a kind of fundamental peace with uncertainty. They have stopped requiring guarantees before they are willing to act. They have stopped waiting until they are completely ready, completely confident, completely sure of the outcome before they take the next step. Because they understand, at some level, that is deeper than just intellectual agreement, that certainty is not available, and that waiting for it is simply another form of standing still. Uncertainty is the native condition of life. This is not a cynical statement, it is a generous one. The fact that the future is not fixed, that it is genuinely open, that what happens next is not already determined, but is being shaped in real time by choices and actions and efforts, means that your choices and actions and efforts actually matter. If everything were already determined, if the outcome were already written and nothing you did could change it, then yes, uncertainty would be frightening in a hopeless kind of way. But uncertainty, in the actual sense, means possibility. It means that the story is still being written, and you have a pen in your hand. People who have made peace with uncertainty do not thereby stop feeling it. They still notice the discomfort of not knowing. They still sometimes lie awake, wishing they could see around corners. But they have learned not to let the discomfort of uncertainty prevent them from engaging fully with the present moment, with the options actually available to them right now, with the step directly in front of them. They move through uncertainty the way a confident swimmer moves through water, not by pretending the water is not there, but by developing the skill to move through it without panic. Alan talked about something that he called the light of understanding, and this is worth spending some real time with because it gets at the heart of what he meant by lighting life's difficulties. He believed that most of the suffering associated with life's hard circumstances comes not from the circumstances themselves, but from the darkness of misunderstanding, the confusion about what is actually happening, why it is happening, and what our relationship to it is. And he believed that when you develop genuine understanding, not just intellectual knowledge, but the deeper, more integrated kind of understanding that comes from patient, honest self-examination, You bring a kind of light into that darkness that genuinely changes what you can see and therefore what you can do. Consider how differently the same event feels when you understand it versus when you do not. A doctor giving you a diagnosis is frightening when you do not understand what it means, what the prognosis is, what the options are. The same diagnosis, with full understanding of what it means and what can be done about it, is still serious, still requires real engagement, but it is not the shapeless terror of ignorance. You can act in relation to what you understand. You are at the mercy of what you do not. This principle applies just as clearly to the inner life. When you do not understand why you keep repeating the same patterns, why you keep finding yourself in the same kinds of difficulties, why certain triggers reliably produce certain reactions in you, you are somewhat at the mercy of those patterns. You experience them as something that happens to you rather than something you are doing. But when you develop genuine understanding of those patterns, when you can see clearly enough to name what is happening and trace its roots, you gain something extremely valuable: the capacity to choose differently, not always, not perfectly, but increasingly over time with real freedom. This is why Alan placed such enormous value on self-knowledge, honest, unflinching self-knowledge that is not in the business of making you feel good about yourself at the expense of seeing yourself clearly. He would say that the person who knows themselves honestly, who can look at their own patterns and tendencies and limitations without either excessive self-criticism or defensive self-justification, that person has a tremendous advantage in navigating life's difficulties, because they can see where they are actually contributing to their own suffering, which is always where the real power to change things lives. This brings us to something that might be the most quietly radical part of Alan's thinking. He believed in the enormous creative power of the human will, properly directed. Not willpower in the popular sense, the white-knuckled forcing of oneself to do things that feel wrong or unnatural, but the deeper will, the fundamental orientation of the whole person toward a clear purpose. He believed that when a person truly commits, not performatively, not with one eye on the exit, but with the full weight of their intention and attention, to becoming a certain kind of person, to developing certain qualities, to moving in a certain direction, something is set in motion that is genuinely powerful. Call it focus, call it intention, call it the alignment of inner and outer resources around a clear purpose. Whatever you call it, it is real and it works. Most people never truly commit in this way. They have preferences and wishes and things they would like to happen, but commitment is different. Commitment means deciding, and really deciding, not just hoping, that this is the direction and this is the kind of person you are choosing to become, and you are going to act accordingly, regardless of how you feel on any given day, and regardless of whether the results are immediately visible. This kind of commitment has a force to it. It changes what you notice, what you prioritize, what you are willing to do, what you are willing to give up. And it begins to subtly reshape the world around you to match the inner reality you have committed to. Let us also talk about the people in our lives, because no discussion of navigating difficulty would be complete without addressing the enormous role that relationships play, both in creating difficulties and in helping us through them. Alan was deeply interested in the quality of our relationships and the way our inner state determines, to a significant degree, the quality of those relationships. He made an observation that is easy to dismiss as simplistic, but is actually quite penetrating. We tend to attract into our lives people who reflect something real about us, about our own inner state, our own patterns, our own unresolved questions. This is not always comfortable to hear. It is much more comfortable to think of the difficult people in our lives as simply difficult people who happen to have landed in our vicinity. But if you notice that you keep encountering the same kinds of difficult people, the same kinds of relational dynamics, in job after job, relationship after relationship, social circle after social circle, the more honest question is not why am I surrounded by difficult people, but what is the invitation here? What am I bringing to these relationships that keeps producing these dynamics? This is not about self-blame. It is about self-knowledge and self-responsibility, which are the prerequisites for genuine change. When you develop clarity about what you bring to your relationships, including the fears that lead you to relate in certain ways, the needs that lead you to make certain demands, the defenses that prevent you from being fully present or honest, You gain the capacity to relate differently. And relating differently, genuinely differently rather than just performing a different role, tends to produce genuinely different relational outcomes. At the same time, Alan was clear that personal development is not about becoming an island. Human beings are relational creatures, and the support of others, genuine, caring, honest support, is not a luxury or a weakness. It is a genuine resource. The wisdom here is not be completely self-sufficient and need no one, but rather take responsibility for your inner life and then bring that growing inner clarity and strength into your relationships, so that the relationships become something other than a place where you warehouse your unresolved difficulties. There is something beautiful that Alan describes about the relationship between inner development and the experience of what he calls beauty, by which he means not just aesthetic beauty, but the broader quality of appreciating the goodness that is actually present in life, even in the midst of difficulty. He noticed that as people develop genuine inner strength, as they cultivate the qualities of patience, courage, honesty, and compassion, they also tend to develop a kind of perceptual opening, a capacity to see more of the good that is actually there, not by ignoring the hard things, but by not being so consumed by them that everything else disappears. This is worth sitting with because it points at something important about the relationship between inner work and joy. The people who seem to genuinely enjoy their lives, who seem to find genuine pleasure and meaning in their daily experience, are not, generally speaking, the people whose lives are easiest. They are often people who have been through significant difficulties and who have developed, through those difficulties, the kind of depth and perspective that allows them to be genuinely grateful for what is good, genuinely present with beauty when it appears, genuinely connected to the people around them. Suffering, when it is engaged with rather than avoided, when it is made meaning of rather than merely endured, tends to produce precisely the qualities of character that make joy available. This is not a comfortable teaching to receive when you are in the middle of something hard. When you are genuinely suffering, the suggestion that your suffering is making you better is not obviously comforting, but looking back from the other side of difficulty that has been genuinely moved through, most people recognize something real in it. They can see how they are different, how they are more themselves, how they have capacities now that they did not have before. And that recognition is not nothing. It is actually the beginning of genuine gratitude for the full spectrum of human experience. Alan was also deeply interested in the question of purpose, and he believed that one of the most reliable remedies for the suffering caused by life's difficulties is a clear, genuine, deeply felt sense of purpose. Not a performance of purpose, not the purpose you think you should have or the purpose that would impress other people, but the purpose that genuinely calls to you from somewhere real, the contribution that only you, with your particular set of experiences and skills and perspectives, can make to the world. When you have a clear sense of purpose, difficulties change their character. They are still difficulties. They still require effort and sometimes cause real pain, but they no longer feel meaningless. They become part of the story of someone moving towards something that genuinely matters, and that context transforms their significance entirely. Viktor Frankl, whom we mentioned earlier, made essentially the same point. The person who has a why can bear almost any how. The absence of purpose does not make life easier. It makes it harder, because every difficulty is experienced against a backdrop of meaninglessness. And meaningless suffering is the hardest kind to bear. Finding your purpose is not a one-time event. It is not a moment of sudden clarity where everything becomes obvious. It is a process of paying honest attention over time to what calls you, what moves you, what you would be doing even if no one were watching, and no one were paying you, and the results were uncertain. It is also a process of developing the courage to actually move toward that thing, even when it feels presumptuous or uncertain or demanding. Purpose that is merely entertained but never acted on is not really purpose. It is fantasy. The transformative power only comes when you begin, however imperfectly, to actually move in its direction. There is a story worth telling here about a man who spent 20 years in an industry that paid him well and rewarded his considerable competence, but that left him feeling, at the end of each day, as though something essential was missing. He could not quite name it. He was not unhappy exactly. He had a good life by most observable measures. but there was a quality of dimness to it, a sense that he was operating at a fraction of his actual energy and engagement, and he had learned to accommodate that dimness, to treat it as simply the adult reality of working life, the price you pay for security and comfort. Then his wife, who was perceptive and also tired of watching him sleepwalk through his days, said something to him that landed like a stone in still water. She said, "What would you do if you knew you could not fail and money were not a consideration?" And he almost dismissed the question because it seemed naive and impractical, but something in him could not let it go. And when he finally sat with it honestly, the answer came with a clarity that surprised him. He would work with young people who were at risk, who needed mentoring and support, and someone who believed in them. He would use his considerable organizational skills and his hard-won understanding of the business world not to move money around, but to build something that gave disadvantaged young people genuine opportunity. He did not quit his job the next day. He was too sensible and too responsible for that. But he began, quietly, to take steps. He started volunteering. He started a conversation with a non-profit that was doing work he admired. He began to learn about the space, to meet people already working in it, to understand what was needed and where his skills could actually contribute. 3 years later, he was working full-time in that field, earning significantly less money than before, and reporting, with consistent and unconditional genuineness, that he had never felt more alive. The dimness was gone, not because his life was easier. It was in many ways harder, more uncertain, more demanding, but because he was finally moving towards something that was genuinely his, something that used all of him rather than just the parts that could be useful to someone else's purpose. This is what Alan meant by purpose as a remedy for difficulty. Not that purpose eliminates difficulty, but that it gives difficulty meaning. And meaning-filled difficulty is navigable in a way that meaningless difficulty simply is not. We are approaching the final movement of this reflection, and it seems right to bring things back to where we began. The question of light. Alan's core metaphor is luminous in both the poetic and the practical sense. He is talking about bringing light into darkness, yes, but he is very specific about where that light comes from. It does not come from circumstances finally working out in your favor. It does not come from other people finally recognizing your value. It does not come from acquiring the things you have decided will make you happy. It comes from inside, from the development of genuine understanding, genuine compassion, genuine courage, genuine clarity about what actually matters. These are the qualities that light life from within, and they are the qualities that make every difficulty not just bearable but genuinely instructive. The person who has developed these qualities is not someone things do not go wrong for. They are someone who, when things go wrong, which they inevitably do, has the inner resources to meet that wrongness with something other than panic, blame, or collapse. They have the patience to stay present. They have the honesty to see clearly. They have the courage to act in the direction of what they believe is right, even when the outcome is uncertain. And they have, perhaps most importantly, the kind of deep-rooted equanimity that comes from knowing themselves well enough to trust themselves in hard moments. This is what the entire arc of Alan's philosophy is building toward. Not the elimination of difficulty, which is neither possible nor even desirable, but the development of the kind of character that can meet difficulty with grace, and that extracts from every hard experience the understanding and strength that make the next experience more navigable. It is a lifelong project, it is demanding, and it is, without question, worth everything it asks of you. Think about the life you want to be living 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Think about the person you want to be, the relationships you want to have, the work you want to be doing, the inner quality of your daily experience. Now, ask yourself, what qualities of character would that person need to have? What would they be able to tolerate that you currently find difficult? What would they do consistently that you currently do inconsistently? What would they no longer be doing that you are still doing now? The gap between who you are today and who that person is not a gap of luck or circumstance or the right opportunity finally arriving. It is a gap of character, and character is developed. One choice, one moment, one difficulty navigated with just a little more grace than the last, at a time. You do not have to be perfect at this. Nobody is. Alan himself would have told you that the path is long and the traveler is always in progress, always learning, always encountering new edges of their own understanding. What matters is not that you get it right every time, but that you keep choosing, keep engaging, keep bringing the best of your current understanding to whatever is right in front of you. That is the practice. And that practice, sustained over a life, produces something extraordinary. There is one final thing that deserves to be said, and it is something that Alan believed with quiet but absolute conviction. That every human being, without exception, has within them the capacity for genuine growth, genuine transformation, genuine light. Not some people, not people born into the right circumstances, not people with the right genetic inheritance or the right early experiences. Every single person. The capacity is there, in you, right now, regardless of where you are starting from, regardless of how many times you have tried and fallen short, regardless of how complicated or entrenched your patterns feel. The light is available. The question is only whether you will choose to tend it. And that choosing, that daily, imperfect, courageous, humble choosing, is the whole of the work. Not the grand gesture, not the perfect decision made at some future point when you are finally ready. The small, consistent, present moment choice to be just a little more honest, a little more patient, a little more courageous, a little more genuinely engaged with the life you are actually living rather than the life you are waiting to begin. That is the teaching. That is the light, and it is entirely, completely, irrevocably available to you. If this resonated with you, if these ideas feel like something you want to carry with you and return to, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Every subscription genuinely matters because it allows us to keep creating content like this and to reach more people who might benefit from hearing it. This channel exists because people like you find value in it, and your support is what keeps it alive and growing. We are genuinely grateful for every one of you who shows up and listens and engages. You are why we do this, and please do not stop here. This channel has a whole library of content like this, summaries, reflections, explorations of the ideas that have shaped the way human beings understand themselves and their possibilities. Every video is an invitation to go a little deeper, to think a little more carefully, to engage with the extraordinary wealth of human wisdom that is available to any of us who choose to seek it out. Browse through our video library, find something that calls to you, and keep the conversation going. Because the work of becoming more fully yourself, of lighting your own particular corner of the world, is a conversation that never really ends, and we would love to keep having it with you. Take care of yourselves. Do the work. Trust the process. The light you are looking for is already inside you, waiting for exactly the kind of attention and care you are now learning to give it.